right? Like the country doesn't work for anybody anymore. So we've proposed, and Pierre's been clear on this, that we need to start tying immigration numbers and targets to homes completed.
Welcome to the Tom Storey Show with Steve Karrasch and Tom Storey, where we discuss everything real estate or whatever else is on our minds.
Welcome back, everybody, to a very special episode of the Tom Storey Show. We have two guests today. One is a return guest, but in a new capacity. Keith Roy has joined us today. He's a federal Conservative candidate for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country, also a friend of the show. And we welcome Scott Aitchison to the show. He's a member of Parliament for the Conservative Party of Canada, for Parry Sound, Muskoka, and the Shadow Minister of Housing, Diversity, and Inclusion. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So, Scott, I want to start first of all, and maybe this is because I don't follow politics as closely as I should be. I didn't actually know going into this that we had shadow ministers. When I first heard it, I said to Steve, I was like, sounds like a job at Hogwarts or something. It sounds really cool. So can you break that down maybe to someone that's watching or listening that doesn't understand like I didn't going into this?
Yeah, I'm happy to. The shadow minister title is sort of I think it's actually a bit of a British thing. They use that a little more frequently than we do. Also known as critics. So the idea between our parliamentary system is that the official opposition, or the party with the second most number of seats, is set up to be critics of the government and to hold them to account in the House of Commons. And so what we do is we match up roles in the opposition party to cabinet ministers, which are actually the government. And so the idea is that we focus on those files. So I focus on particularly the housing file, but also we are to be seen as a government in waiting. And so we structure things much like the government does. So we have a shadow cabinet, we have shadow cabinet meetings, and we go through the process of reviewing, legislation and policy as a team. And so we are preparing ourselves to be a government. We would like that to happen a lot sooner than later, but
yeah,
we'll get there.
Makes total sense that you're following along everything that happens if there were to be a change. And Keith, for the viewers that maybe didn't catch you on the first episode you were on the show, obviously me and Steve have known you for a long time in the real estate world. Now we're having a political conversation. Could you give me some background on what's changed since we last spoke with you?
Yeah, I've run a real estate practice in the Lower Mainland for 18 years, and I've always been politically active and engaged, as many realtors are, because you're dealing with taxes and people's livelihoods, and you're being brought into people's circumstances, which are obviously affected by government. And when this election cycle started to gear up, I've known Pierre Poilievre for 22, 23 years, and I've always been interested in the housing file. I started exploring running for a Conservative Party nomination. A lot of people encouraged me to do that, including Scott. And I had a contested nomination to become the Conservative candidate in a riding with, as you said, a very long name, West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country. So I'm the Conservative candidate. I'm going to fly the Conservative banner and be Pierre Poilievre's candidate in that riding in the carbon tax election whenever we have it.
And okay, so here's where I want to go next with this, and I know Steve's going to jump in with a question, but I feel like it, and Keith, I know how you feel, Scott. I did my research on you coming into this. I saw a lot of your videos. Most Canadians are fed up because housing prices has continued to gone up. First-time home buyers feel like maybe they're stuck renting. If you look at the home ownership rate in Canada, it's gone down. We were at 69%. We're at 63%. We're on trend here if this remains, where it could get to a point where it's like 50-50. So maybe, Keith, to continue with that, just initially, like if the Conservatives got in, how would that change? What would be done?
Well, the whole theory that Pierre has talked about is firing the gatekeepers. And there's a lot of things in the way to building homes in Canada. Real estate, as you know, is supply and demand. Immigration has been ramped up exponentially under this government. They kind of broke the agreement we all had with respect to immigration. So we've got a large number of people coming to the country who all came within the rules and shouldn't be blamed for this. But it is the demand side has gone up dramatically. And then on the supply side, we're building less homes than we were in the 1970s, Scott. Um, so we've got more people, less homes being built, the same amount of land that we've always had, and nothing's getting done other than a bunch of housing announcements and just like an absolute flurry of announcements, but there's no homes being built. There's no shovels in the ground. And the Conservatives are about getting things done, actually building those homes so that people have places to live. And quite frankly, the big thing is you just stop the spending and the inflationary. You got to stop the inflationary spending, which will, of course, bring down the cost. Bring down inflation, which will bring down the cost of everything. And then finally, it's taxes, which are the number one source of expenses when building a home. So it's all those things. We can get really specific with it. And Scott's got a lot more on this than I do because he's on the policy side. I'm just out here flocking houses for people.
Well, that's what I'm interested to. I'm interested here, Scott. So you're like the critic. You're the guy that's following along to see, okay, what is the federal government doing right now, or maybe not doing at the moment? So what have you discovered in reviewing their policies? Like, where has it gone so wrong?
Well, Keith, I can just sort of elaborate on what Keith was saying, because everything he said was absolutely bang on, and this concept of the gatekeepers. What we're talking about is the fact that it takes so long to get permission to build a home, whether it's the charges and the public hearings and all that kind of stuff. It can take years and years and years to rezone a piece of property, and so that time is money, right? It costs more money, and every time a municipality levies a new charge onto a developer, that goes right to the bottom line. And so it's made houses more expensive because of the delays, because of the fees and charges, and as a result, we're just not getting things built fast enough because it just takes too long. And then when it is built, it's outrageously expensive. So when we talk about firing the gatekeepers, we're talking about streamlining the process. Keith is right. Back in 1974, Canada built the most homes that year than ever before, or since, for that matter. It was about 245,000 homes were built that year. Our average today is just over 200,000, and our population is more than double what it was back then. So we've ramped up supply, we've ramped up demand, we've restricted supply, and as a result, you see what's happening. And so, and of course, the housing continuum, it's not just your first time home buyer that we're looking at, but it's people move through the housing continuum. You often will move based on the needs of your family, and so right now one of the biggest blockages in moving through the housing continuum is purpose-built rentals, and of course those rentals, all the other restrictions we've put on landlords and things to make it more and more difficult for them. Property taxes continue to go up, but they've been limited in what they can do with rents, and so it's a tough business to be in. And so as a result of all these restrictions, there's not nearly enough supply, and we need to remove the painfully long processes. We need to hold municipal governments to account, and we've talked about doing that by basically holding up money. So the federal government's activity or involvement in this process is kind of limited, because it really is cities and provinces that are on the front lines of the housing situation. But the federal government has spending power, and every city, every province all wants federal money for infrastructure projects, which are important for housing. And so instead of just sort of handing out big checks and smiling for the cameras, we'll actually put some, we'll hold them to account and say, well, you won't get money from a Pierre Poilievre government unless you're speeding up the process, making housing more available, making it cheaper, and getting out of the way. The solution to the housing crisis in Canada is the most classically small C conservative solution. It's less government.
And I've heard the 70s come up a lot where we built so many homes during then. In the 70s, was most of what was being built, was it rentals then as well? Because when we talk about the purpose built, so I'm here in Toronto, and what we're noticing is right now, no one's buying new construction condos because the numbers don't make sense. And we know in 3-4 years, this is going to be an issue. But what is coming to the market, the product that is coming to the market, is these purpose built rentals. Is that just step one in the solution here? Or do we also need to focus on, well, we got to build properties that people can actually buy and not just rent?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right about the condo market. In Toronto right now, it already is an issue. There's about 90,000 units that people are just not going to close on.
Yeah.
It's a huge issue. And yes, more rentals are being built, in part because a couple of moves that the federal government made, which made sense by removing the GST on purpose-built rentals. The Ford government provincially matched that with the provincial tax, so there's no HST. But what Keith was saying earlier about inflation and rampant government spending, which is driving up inflation, interest rates have spiked as a result of all this spending, and that's actually made it more difficult. So while we started to build some rentals, a lot of projects are stalled right now because it's pretty simple math. You've got to attract that investment. You got to get a return on it, and if the numbers don't add up, you don't build. So we're a bit stalled. We need to do more to make it attractive to build. And yeah, I mean, back then the federal government had specific policies targeted at building rentals, and the Trudeau government of the day canceled those policies and decided they were going to get into the housing business and they were going to build homes. They started and promptly stopped, and the federal government has gradually gotten out of the business of supporting housing year after year ever since. And so this is really, the federal government is getting back into the business. But of course, it's a little more complex than just photo ops and spending announcements. And as I always say, if photo ops and talking points could solve problems, we wouldn't have a problem in this country. But they don't. You need action, and we're not getting that right now.
Keith, we've heard. Sorry, yeah,
go on. Your question of rent. We need rental, but we also need houses that people can afford to buy. Housing's a continuum, and if you can solve the rental crisis, which we have, which is, the typical immigrant family comes off the plane and they get to Canada, they're not buying a home. We hear that in like some neighborhoods in Toronto and certainly Vancouver with the influence of Chinese money. But for the most part, an immigrant family moves to a new place and they rent for a period of time. A young person graduates university and God willing, they can afford to leave their parents' basement. They go out and rent for some period of time. So those are pressures on the housing system in different places. If you can solve it at that early stage and get the purpose-built rental that's affordable for people, and I don't mean like the government technical term of income restricted affordable housing. I mean just basic homes that people can afford that generally line up with the paychecks that they bring home. You can take the pressure off down the line and you have less people trying to buy those condos because they're in comfortable, secure, safe rental situations. So you pull back some of the pressure. So then the next stage of housing, that early townhouse product that people can afford to buy, because there's less pressure on it, the prices of those come down and we can build more and we can change some of the zoning and catch up with some of that missing middle housing. So going after the rentals first helps solve things down the line. It also solves the problem on the back end of the housing continuum where the senior sells, grandma sells her West Side house in Vancouver or, Forest Hill house. She's got a couple $1 million. She could go into a secure rental building without fear of losing the security of tenure down the road. But right now there's nowhere for her to go. So she doesn't leave her big house and she's living in $3, $4, $5 million. It's just tied up. And she's got, 5, 6 bedrooms, 4 of which are empty, 1 of which is for sewing and 1 of which is for grandma to sleep in. And so you've got this bedroom problem going on around the country. And so you can solve it early with the rental stuff. And what the government's doing right now, to hitch onto Scott's point, for what we would do different, the current government is making bureaucrats tick boxes and giving them money without actually building homes. I mean, there was an example.
How are they getting away with that though? Like how are they still giving them money if they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing?
So they're giving them money at the front end and then the municipalities just aren't following through. They're like, oh, here's money from our housing accelerator fund. okay, you've ticked all these boxes, you meet all the bureaucratic requirements to say that you might maybe one day perhaps build a home. So we're going to build the transit infrastructure around you. So we fund the transit infrastructure at a federal level, and the municipal government turns around and says we're going to do this, and then they just don't do it. So what the Conservatives have said is we're gonna flip that. We're gonna promise the money. We're gonna make it available to municipalities. We're gonna hold it in a trust. And when the houses are built and the keys go in the door and the families move in, the federal government will release the infrastructure money back to the municipalities. And the municipalities will be able to borrow against these trusts. And they might incur some additional interest costs at a municipal level, but there's going to be accountability to getting the money. And if they don't produce the houses, they're not getting the money. And you're going to see the citizens in those communities fight back against their municipal governments because they're going to have an infrastructure deficit, because the infrastructure is not going to get built, because the money's not going to get released, because the houses weren't built. And so it's again, classic small C conservative. There's accountability in this. The Liberals doing without accountability.
Where my mind was going with the purpose-built rentals is you said, like, not government definition of affordable, but relatively affordable, but at least from what's penciling and what they're building. And I'm just talking in Toronto, it's like these purpose-built rentals, they're coming fast and furious to the market, but they're expensive. We've actually had these companies reach out to us as realtors who we don't typically do those buildings, saying, hey, can you send some people our way? Because I think they're having problems filling them. But perhaps it's like either they build things that are a little bit cheaper to rent out, or just the more they build, naturally that will push the prices down, and maybe that's what we're looking at, right?
Exactly. It's just supply. If you massively increase the supply, the prices will naturally come down, and the market will start to level all of that out. And then you just need to, on the back end of this, the construction side, you need to stop the inflationary spending. The government of Canada does not have a revenue problem. It has a spending problem. And the inflationary spending drives up the cost of all the goods, which makes the housing more expensive to build, which is why builders don't build it, and people can't afford to live in it once we get it.
Realtors, it's time to up your game. Realty Ninja allows you to create a stunning lead capturing and hassle-free website that looks great and will match with your current brand. They are a sponsor of this show, and they're giving listeners 20% off your first year, and you don't pay $1 until you launch. Join the thousands of real estate agents across this country, including Steve, the cheapest person I know that uses their services. realtyninja.com/Tom. And now, back to the podcast. Steve, I want you to jump in here with the NDP announcement that happened not that long ago. And by the way, this episode is coming out just a week after we've recorded it, just in case anything changes in that meantime. But Steve, you want to take it over?
Are you saying you hope there's an election?
I'm saying there's possibilities are there.
We're getting closer, right? Yeah, I mean, there's so much going on. There seems to be a new thing every single day. So we've got the whole Jagmeet saga trying to get his pension thing going on, which is very interesting. I personally have a belief that right around the end of February is when Jagmeet's probably going to have enough of this current government. Just a suspicion that I have going on. I don't know if you saw it the other day, or if you guys saw this. This was actually just yesterday. They're proposing that no corporations. The NDP is federally proposing that no corporations are allowed to buy rentals again, or affordable rentals again at any point in time, which would just sling us into some sort of a slumlord. Might take 5 or 10 or 15 years, but if you don't have any corporations buying any rentals in the future, you're going to end up with decrepit buildings at some point in time.
Well, just do the math on it. Do the math on it. We need 6 million homes in this country. By any measure, that's trillions with a T, trillions of spending on housing. And I know that these NDP folks can really borrow, but they can't borrow that much. We must attract private sector investment. We have to. And the NDP just don't seem to get that. The math just doesn't work. Maybe they don't understand math. I don't know.
Well, do you think that they, I struggle with this a lot. There is a lot of voters that I think the NDP are going for, and definitely now the Liberals have decided to go for, where they think the government has money. And they don't realize the government is just taking its citizens' money, in order to do something with it, which is obviously spend more than they take in, right? Like, at what point can we stop this crazy narrative of everybody else but me and the government is greedy, and we're going to take from all these greedy people? Like, that seems to be where the NDP is hanging their hat. Everybody that is a problem in your life is greedy. But everybody but you is greedy. And me, I'm not greedy either. I'll roll into Parliament with a Rolex on. I'm not greedy, but you're greedy, right? Like, that's where we seem to be. And I think that's why. So I'll just leave this. I don't even have a point here, Tom. I'll just leave this with you guys.
Welcome to the show, Scott.
Welcome to the show.
I like the point you're making. It's good.
We have a provincial election coming here. So I just put something up on the channel. Like, we have a Canadian audience, but if you were in BC right now and your pick is the NDP, the Greens, or the Conservative Party, who are you picking? And I think everybody's coming around because it's like an 85% poll right now of like, we just need change. We need some sort of responsibility, and we need to talk about the Conservatives. And I think most of that has to do with the fact that we are taxing the crap out of people for climate change, of which won't fix climate change. So we're going to be poor and have climate change. So, like, I think the majority of people are coming around to it. I'm just shocked at the amount of people that are still like, the problem is, I don't know, my employer, I guess, the companies. Like, I just can't get it. Sorry, Tom, I will stop my rant right now. That was not well.
But can you ask a question?
Okay, I do have a question. Don't you think, or I guess what would the Conservative side of it be? You guys would know. Don't you think the easiest way to try and plug the dam of the issue of affordable housing right now would be to maybe not have the amount of immigration per quarter that we used to have per year? Does that make sense? Like, am I a wild, crazy person to think that that's an okay, like, what were we, 280,000 people a year pre-COVID, and now we're 1.2 million people per year post-COVID?
Yeah,
absolutely. We've proposed, Pierre's been really clear on this policy, and you know what, you were crazy to say that 2 years ago, Steve. You would have been accused of quite frankly, of racism. And now people have come to the conclusion, like, wait a second, this doesn't even work for immigrants who are here, right? Like, the country doesn't work for anybody anymore. So we've proposed, and Pierre's been clear on this, that we need to start tying immigration numbers and targets to homes completed, which has two benefits. One, we then have homes available for people when they arrive, in addition to the fact that we have natural growth rates here in Canada, to say nothing of the fact that we have to catch up with, as Scott said, about 6 million homes. But it also has the knock-on effect of solving some other problems we face in the country, like the healthcare challenges. You know, Tom recently spent some time engaging with the healthcare system for the arrival of a new child.
8 hours in the waiting room.
Yeah, right. And if you look around, there's all different cultures and diversities and languages that are happening in the hospital right now, because there's just been so much immigration over the last number of years. And again, it's not the immigrants' fault. Like, they came here, we sold them a false bag of goods. We told them we had a strong, flourishing country with lots of land and housing and a great healthcare system. But instead they show up, there's lots of land, there's no housing, everything's expensive, and then the healthcare doesn't work. Like,
our immigration system was the envy of the world. The point system we came up with, it was a nonpartisan issue, but we had an amazing immigration system, and we need we need more people to immigrate to this country. But demographic issue, it's an economic issue. But the current government broke the system by just throwing the system out the window and opening the floodgates in a number of different ways. We need more people, but you've got to plan for it. It's not just housing; it's schools, it's doctors, it's all those services that everybody needs that nobody can access now because there was no plan. They again, if talking points can solve problems, it's like these guys have a great idea and then they never think about how they're going to implement it or how their follow-up question to see if anything got done. And you see the results. You see the results of of inept government. The situation
what is the end game, or was there? So maybe that's the question. Is it they weren't thinking, or is it no, they thought that we need 4 times the population increase than we had previous?
It was a cover-up, Steve. This government has been running anemic economic growth for its entire 9 years, and they are trying to hide their anemic economic growth behind immigration. If you take immigration out of the equation, we've probably been in a recession for the better part of a decade. They've just been tacking on more and more people to make it look like they're growing and they're getting along. And you'll forgive the prime minister if he doesn't think about monetary policy. But he was thinking about it, and he was thinking, this is bad. How do we hide this? And they hid it behind immigration.
And do we simply just go back to the way it used to be before it was broken? Do we change the point system? Like, what if the Conservatives get in? Not to say exactly you can say what's going to happen, but like, is there a theory of how we get back to where it was before that was the envy of everybody?
Let me give you the history, and then let me have Scott give you the answer on what we would do about immigration. This goes back to the Pearson-Diefenbaker era. And there was general bipartisanship between the Liberals and the Conservatives at the time on how to structure this immigration system. And so since the 50s, 60s, when this really came around, we've kind of had the right number of people from the right mix of countries with a combination of economic benefits to Canada and humanitarian benefits to the world in terms of who we brought in and their economic status. And this continued along for decades, and it worked reasonably well. We were able to keep up with housing demand, and healthcare generally worked. And the rich social fabric that is Canada and the tapestry was developed over the course of 6 decades. And as Scott said, the Liberals broke the system. And they did it because they were trying to hide the anemic economic growth. So Scott, go with the solution.
Yeah, and we do need to get back to the system that worked very well. It did work well. I don't know what the correct number of people coming into the country every year should be, but we may have to reduce it for a bit to get caught up to ourselves. And so, far smarter people than me will be doing the analysis of those kinds of things. But yeah, it was an amazing system. And countries used to ask us about it because they wanted to emulate it, wanted to copy it. They don't ask for that advice now because it's not working. So I don't know what the exact numbers are, but we'll have to really trim it dramatically to get caught up.
Is there any benefit? Because I've heard this come up a lot where people use Canada as a place to come to then go to the States where we're a stopgap. Is that something that needs to stop, that we're just seen as like, well, that's a little bit easier to get there, and then we're going to go where potentially we really want to go? Is that a big issue?
It is an issue, and it's an issue also in terms of what we often call the brain drain. Losing really skilled, talented people to better opportunities in the United States, and it's in all fields of endeavor. Including things like investment in housing. It's a lot easier to get homes built in places like Texas, and we need capital to build homes. Capital can move very easily around the world, and it goes where it can be invested. And so it's all an issue. We are competing with the United States, and we are failing at that.
So you set me up perfectly, Keith.
Okay, go.
I was just going to bring up capital gains, but we'll get to that after.
Yeah, I think the greater problem is not so much people who are stopping in Canada on their way to another country. It's that people who wanted to come to Canada got here and are left disappointed and leave. That's the greater problem. Like every time I'm in an Uber, I get in the conversation with the Uber driver, who's inevitably an immigrant. In Vancouver, most of our Uber drivers are either East Indian or Iranian.
Keith, do you tell them you're a realtor or a politician now? What's the answer at the Uber?
I actually asked them. I asked them all, who would you vote for in the next election? And I don't tell them who I am. And like 9 out of 10 just go off on Trudeau. They're like, I came here 5 years ago. I thought it was great. I'm living in a shared 1-bedroom in Surrey. I'm driving Uber. This is not the dream I was sold. I'm trying to get into Australia. I'm trying to get into New Zealand. They're trying to go to other places. And so I think that is the greater problem, is the false advertising of the promise of Canada for the immigrants who have come.
Now, we talked about capital and capital moving around. Excuse me. Capital gains inclusion rates. There are a lot of people that look at investors in real estate as the bad guys. There's lots that look at them as the good guys that bring the inventory that helps things actually get built. The way that we build condos in Toronto and Vancouver is you have to sell 70% of them before you can put a shovel in the ground. We're not even doing that right now. So in the future, that's going to be an issue. Capital gains inclusion rate. Is there any discussion if government were to change, if that stays in place, if that comes back? What's going on with that?
Well, Pierre specifically has talked about doing a little more than just, looking at the new capital gains inclusion rates that the Liberals just increased. He's actually talked about doing a full review of our tax system because, as I think we would all agree, our taxes are too high. We have a government that operates as if every nickel that you have is actually theirs, and they'll give you some back if you beg enough. And so we need a complete review of the whole system. But specifically, when you think about why the Liberals made this change, it was a bit of a cash grab. I think they wanted to scare people into selling stuff right away that they were thinking of maybe selling, so they could cash in and keep their deficit from going over $40 billion. And of course, once again, this is a time where we need trillions of investment in housing. What a dumb move to try to scare away investment, scare away that capital. Where I think it's mind-numbing. It's like the left hand doesn't know what the far left hand is doing in that government. It's unbelievable.
And you hear it and you think, okay, maybe this stops the mom and pop real estate investors from buying another pre-construction condo or something like that. But when you break it down to the corporations, and we're talking about like doctors thinking of leaving Canada, it's just like there's a domino effect here that doesn't make, in my opinion on this, doesn't make the lives of Canadians better. In fact, it could make it a little bit worse just to cover up potentially what you're saying, which is the deficit, right? Is that fair?
Hey, folks, if you're looking for a real estate agent in the city of Toronto, let's face it, you gotta call my buddy Tom Storey of the Storey team and Royal LePage Signature in Toronto, Ontario. They're your obvious choice because Tom is not just the co-host of this podcast. No, he is a real life and top producing real estate agent in the city of Toronto. There's nobody out there that knows the condo market better than Tom and his team in downtown, but they do service the entire city of Toronto and any of your residential real estate needs. So if you're looking for an agent, do not hesitate to reach out to Tom, book a call with him using the link down below in the description of this podcast, and let Tom guide you through your real estate journey. And now back to the podcast.
I think that's absolutely accurate. Yeah.
It's not just to cover up the deficit. They're covering up the deficit this year in advance of an election. They're trying to make it look better that in the fall economic update, because they had this big influx of cash that showed up in June. And your audience is, there's a lot of realtors in the audience, and I'm going to give you some anecdotal evidence of how this capital gains is impacting people. I had a gentleman who owned a condo downtown. He bought it pre-sale off the developer in 1997. He lived there for 1 year, and then he didn't like it. He rented it out to the same tenant since 1999. So this woman had lived there. She was in her early 80s. Capital gains rules come in. You have a 6-week window before the gain came into effect. He phoned me. We did the math. The impact of him selling before or after that was somewhere in the neighborhood of $25,000 to $30,000, and he realized he was unlikely to see growth in his asset of $25,000 to $30,000 in the foreseeable future. So he decided to sell, and in doing so, he paid on the old structure, but he paid the gain. So the government got the gain this year; they got the cash infusion. An 83-year-old woman was displaced from her home and had to go find additional or different rental accommodation in the Vancouver market.
For probably double or triple the price.
Which was just the reality of it. And he wasn't a bad guy. He just had the government forced his hand, because he's also an old guy who has to, think about himself and look at his money and his situation. When you make it so undesirable to own real estate, nobody wants to own it. And unless we're going to get into a communist style system where everyone gets a terrible home provided by the government that's centrally heated, like you go to Moscow, these homes that the communists built, they're centrally heated, but like they're centrally heated from miles away. And so by the time the hot water gets to the building, it's lukewarm water. Like, unless we want to go to that system where everybody's provided a house, we need private rentals. We need individual landlords. We need corporate landlords. We need people who are willing to take on the work of being a landlord. And the government, just through every possible policy, somehow they're making it more and more difficult to own and operate rentals.
Well, it's funny you say that, Keith, because I just heard an announcement that says you will, in fact, rent off of the government in government housing. And it appears like that may be the solution. However, I want to give you credit. I don't like to give Keith credit very often, just for the record on the show. I will give you credit. I screenshotted something you put out a little while ago when that announcement was made about freeing up government land for 99-year leases. I can't figure out if we have so much government land why it just couldn't be sold and developed, but that's fine. So we're going to retain it and the government's going to keep it. But this is a promise that's been made 4, 5, something like that times over the, I got it right here. 2015, as a part of Justin Trudeau's platform, was to free up government lands for housing. 2017 was to make federal lands available for housing. 2023 was to build more homes on those public lands, by the way. It took them 4 years to decide they're going to free up the land and then build on them. And then 2024, we've just got the same announcement. So like maybe that solution is free government housing. Is it free government housing? What's the plan here?
Let me jump in. There is no plan, really. The federal government owns thousands of buildings and properties, thousands. And they've been promising that you did a great job pointing out all the times they've promised to do this. One of the sites that they've identified is the old Downsview Park in Toronto, right? It used to be an air base. And so, they've done some development there. Canada Lands Corporation has done some. And so now they've identified a couple more properties. So they've got a list of 56 properties across Canada. Only 5 of them are actually ready for a proposal to build something. The other 51, they're interested in talking about. So it's not actually ready to go for housing. I actually was at one of the sites that's ready for proposals just last week. Went down there and I did a little video. And it's largely a parking lot. And it's been sitting empty for so long, there's grass growing through the parking lot now. So back when they first promised this, they could have made it available 9 years ago because it's been sitting there empty and nothing happening. So again, they're all talk and no action. And frankly, it takes too long, if you can imagine, for the behemoth federal government to determine that some piece of land or some building is surplus to their use. Bureaucrats don't really want to give up buildings because that means they have to give up people oftentimes. We need it's a crisis in this country. And when you're in a crisis situation, you pull out all the stops. And these guys are just drifting along and, oh, look at us. We've announced a couple more properties. It's like they don't have any sense of urgency whatsoever about what's going on in this country. Uh, and again, this is the result that you see. They want Canadians to think that they're solving the problem, but it's all window dressing. It's nothing real.
Okay, guys, I did a presentation for a real estate office recently on the federal budget, which was largely billed as a housing budget. And I called my presentation "A Bunch of Bureaucracy." I shared this with Scott. I'm just going to read off really quickly a couple of the initiatives that the federal government is doing to build houses right now. And you tell me how well this is working. Public Land Action Council Secretariat, New Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund to provinces and then municipality, Affordable Housing Innovation Fund, Housing Supply Challenge, Green Construction Through Wood Program, Home Building Technology and Innovation Fund, Canada Greener Homes Grants and Loans Program, CMHC to deliver flood reinsurance, House Homelessness Strategy, Rapid Housing Initiative, Interim Housing Assistance Program, Urban, Rural, and Northern Indigenous Housing Strategy Implementation Program, Affordable Housing Fund, Canada Green Building Strategy, which, by the way, is different than the Canada Greener Homes Grant and Loans Program, and the Canada Greener Homes Affordability Program. It's just a bunch of bureaucracy. That's all they're doing. It's just announcement after announcement. And the last budget said they want to build 553,000 homes per year in Canada. Our 10-year average is 215,000 homes. So their plan it calls for about 3.8 million homes in 7 years, which is, I did the math on this, 3.87 million homes in 7 years. It's 2,439 days, which is 1,587 homes per day. They're telling you that their plan is going to build you 1.1 homes per minute in Canada. That is a great announcement. And it is not even close to happening.
Keith, I've heard people talk about the fact that when they say homes, some of these homes could be like beds in retirement homes. Is that true? Or are we actually building homes? Those numbers, those real homes?
None of it's true, Tom. None of it's true. It's just announcements and selfies and photos. The guy in charge, Scott's colleagues, the housing minister, Sean Fraser, was the immigration minister. He broke the system and then they hired him to fix it. It's not going to work.
You know how they say true life is always stranger than fiction? Like, you couldn't make this stuff up. That's how bad it is. That's how bad it is.
I'd love to see behind the scenes, the group chat that you guys have. That's what I really want to see. But because I know Keith too well. All right, so Keith, all the things that you just talked about, that's a lot of different things, which in my mind means that that's a lot of different jobs created in the government. And one of the charts that I've seen really take off in a viral way on social media is private sector versus government growth. And a lot of people think this is an issue. Keith, just off camera for you, people can't see it, but it says common sense.
Yeah.
Is that common sense that just needs to flip here? We need private sector to start being productive and get Canada back to potentially where it was previously?
Canada, like I said, Canada has a productivity problem. It's been growing exponentially, and we've been hiding it behind immigration. And so we've been growing immigration exponentially to hide our exponential problem. That's it. And we need less government everywhere. We need less taxes. We need less administration of if there's less taxes, there's less administration of those taxes. Right. If you have a simpler tax system, it's easier to enforce. Enforcement becomes, we go back to a system of voluntary enforcement because it's understandable. The reason we have like people going outside the lines on taxes is because they don't understand them.
Mm-hmm.
This is an important distinction because there's clearly a role for government in our society, and the services that government delivers, they should be effective and efficient, but they're not. And Canadians deserve a much better service than they're getting. You think about the fact that the federal government has increased the public service by 30%. They've hired over 100,000 more people and spent $25 billion on consultants at the same time. And so I would challenge anybody in this country to tell me that the service they get from the federal government is improved by 30%. It gets too big and too cumbersome, and it winds up delivering poorer service. And so it needs to be trimmed. It needs to be streamlined, and we need to make sure that the services that Canadians want are being delivered effectively, efficiently, and actually providing the service that Canadians need.
None of those 100,000 bureaucrats were teachers, doctors, nurses, firefighters, policemen, ambulance drivers. None of them. They were bureaucrats at desks at their home.
This is just a large example of this meeting could have been an email, basically. It keeps going down one after the other. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah.
This country could have been an email.
Yeah, there you go.
I got one, Tom. I got one. What? Okay, so we're talking about taxes drive me crazy. Taxes. I'm making a good living, and I feel like I'm getting further and further behind every year. I don't feel like there's a benefit, and a lot of that is because the money that I do earn, I end up giving the lion's share to the government to give to other people, of which is not used effectively. I do view, and I think most Canadians view, their primary residence as obviously their number one asset. It's probably going to be most people's retirement. It's their safety net. If they can pay it off before retirement, it's where they get to live without a high cost of living for the future. But now there's all this talk about the possibilities of either capital gains on principal residence being the next cash cow that the feds have to pull out, or they're even talking about some version of a home equity tax, meaning that if you have a valuable home and you're living in it and you don't sell it, they still want to possibly attack your equity in your home. Do you guys have any comments, or what is the realistic nature that they might come after the equity of Canadians in their principal residences?
I think it's a very real possibility. This is how they do it. This is how the Liberals do it. They talk about an idea like, taxing the sale of your principal residence, right? And right now it's exempt from capital gains. They talk about it, and then everybody gets upset. And they, no, we're not going to do that. And then it dies down for a little bit. And then a year later, they'll talk about it again. But no, we're not going to do that. And then they'll have the CMHC do a study on it, but they're not going to do it, right? And then the Prime Minister will go and visit, some university professor at UBC who believes this should happen. Mm-hmm. But no, we're not going to do it. So this is how they do these things. They get people a little more used to the idea, and they let things sort of blow over, and then they bring it up again, and eventually they'll try to implement it. I don't trust them one bit. And what Keith said is bang on. That they don't have a revenue problem. They get too much money. They have a spending problem because they think that the government should be all things and do all things for people. I listen. They talk about it way too much to not believe for one second that they would do it if they thought they could get away with it, and that's what they're trying to do.
If you need insurance, you need to go where I go, squareone.ca. At squareone.ca, you can get a quote done in just a matter of minutes. If you're a tenant, landlord, or a homeowner and you need a policy, go to squareone.ca, or better yet, go to squareone.ca/The Tom Storey Show and save $20. That's squareone.ca/The Tom Storey Show for your discount on home insurance right now.
The Prime Minister had a meeting with Generation Squeeze on this exact issue and tried to hide it, and it came out. Here's a realistic scenario where this plays out. The Prime Minister is desperately trying to cling to power. The NDP loves the idea of taxing greedy people who own houses. And I can see a scenario where the NDP, as a requirement for their support in a confidence vote in the spring, agrees to a federal budget that adds some small tax on principal residence. And it could be a short-term thing, like the British Columbia did this. If they added a timeline which to when a tax is applicable to your principal residence. I think it's 2 years, Steve. in British Columbia, if you own your home less than 2 years, you pay a home flipping tax.
Yeah.
That's a tax on your principal residence, because there might be a scenario where you need to move inside of a year for whatever reason. It's incrementalism. And I can see a scenario next spring while the Prime Minister is desperately holding on to power, where he sells out to the NDP for their support, and you end up with just an incremental tax on your principal residence in some way, shape, or form.
It's only going to impact 0.2% of people.
Yep.
Don't forget that income tax was a temporary measure during the war. So,
And property transfer tax, I believe, was a temporary measure in British Columbia.
Yeah.
We're seeing it here. Like, we're seeing that playbook in BC, right? Because you have the NDP who are now starting to realize it's a pretty close election probably going to be called here in BC in the next little bit. So now they're just jamming everything down our throats that they possibly can while they still have majority, knowing full well that undoing that is more difficult than putting it in the first place. Right. So they're just slamming things like recently we've had tenancy eviction rules changed. Things like, for instance, when I became a landlord, it was always rent increases were 2% plus inflation. And then they became nothing. And now, oh, by the way, it's inflation, but it's also not the real inflation numbers. It's less than the inflation numbers. So like and now everybody, if you ever went back to 2% plus inflation, which was normal forever, that would be the absolute end of the world, because people are now used to this different standard, right? And that's what's actually we're seeing it here. So it's driving landlords away. Landlords are leaving British Columbia, and they're on purpose. Like I'm in Surrey, Scott, and the amount of tenanted properties for sale right now is crazy.
Yeah.
And those tenants are all going to have to leave and compete. And I'm also a landlord where I have a current unit that's on the market to be re-rented as soon as the tenant leaves. And you should see what I'm getting. You should see the majority of people asking to rent my 2-bedroom unit are 4 adults sharing, or a version of foreign students asking me. I've had this question multiple times. How many foreign students will you let me put in your unit? I'm a foreign student. I'm coming with my friends. How many will you let me have in there? Right? Like that's what we're coming up against.
Yeah.
I recently had a father with a 5-year-old apply for a 500 square foot unit that I manage. It's a tragedy.
It's common here. Most of our 1-bedrooms in Surrey are being rented by families of 3 or more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The housing story in Canada is an absolute tragedy that didn't need to happen. And, there is hope for a better future with Pierre as the Prime Minister and Scott and I in Parliament. And it's not going to be solved overnight. I don't want to leave people with the wrong impression on that, but we can restore the future opportunity that Canada used to offer.
We can, and we will. And this is, let me get a little plug in here for my buddy Keith. I know you guys like to slag him a little bit, but this is a guy that actually understands this issue very, very well, right? Keith and I talk a lot about this issue, and Parliament needs to have people like Keith there who understand this, right? So if there are any folks from West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky country watching right now, make sure you vote for Keith Roy. We need guys like Keith in Ottawa.
Keith, can I ask you a question? Because so far, I'm sure most of our audience is loving this, but there's a few people that are on the other side that are like, they're just spewing the opposite of what we believe in. If I'm that person, which I'm not, but I want to be fair with everybody here. How do you talk to people? Like, Keith, knocking on doors isn't new for what you've done for a living. If you knock on a door and someone opens and go like, I disagree with everything that you guys are talking about. Is there a way to have a conversation where you can make people maybe see that their life could be better if they decided to vote in your direction? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, it seems to me like the current Liberal talking point is, don't believe your lying eyes. We're doing a good job. Don't Do not believe what you see. Those tent cities, those are temporary. We didn't create them. They're actually not even there. Just ignore them. Oh, the fact that your kids have to live 500 kilometers away from you and you never get to see your grandchildren, that wasn't us. It's not actually happening. Your life is good. And it'll get worse with the bad conservative man. He's going to make it worse. He's going to cut things. We'll probably cut a couple things. We'll cut things like inflation, taxes, cost of living, the things that are really bad in your life. So the conversation I often have at the doors, and what's interesting in this election cycle, Tom, and I've knocked as a volunteer for other for other elections for conservative candidates. Virtually everyone in Canada is an accessible voter for a conservative candidate these days. There's very few people who actually think Canada is on the right track. They might not always agree with all the solutions, but they do agree with the fact that Canada is on the wrong track. And so the conversation with people is, what do you think we should, are you happy with the way things are? No. Okay. So maybe we can try something different and perhaps our plan will work. And so people are accessible in a way that they've never been in the past.
And there's a lot of people that just don't vote. I mean, Scott, could you maybe talk about that? Like people that want change need to go make their voice heard. I don't know in the last election what the percentage of Canadians that voted. I know the last one we had in Toronto with our most recent mayor, it was really embarrassing, the percentage that it was won by how many votes happened. Is that something you guys are trying to do too? Like just get people to actually go and make their voice heard?
Yeah, I got to engage people. Municipal elections tend to have, and certainly in Ontario, tend to have lower turnouts than federal and provincial elections anyhow. But, I think people are motivated by what's impacting them. And I think that turnout in this next federal election will be huge because the number of Canadians, like Keith says, I mean he's knocking on doors all the time and talking to people who are struggling, with inflation and governments that promise the world but never deliver. There's too many Canadians struggling to find a place to live, put food on the table. Food bank usage is as high. It's higher than it's ever been, ever, right now. And so, Canadians are looking not just for hope but for solutions. And I think turnout will be pretty high in the next federal election because more and more people are struggling and they're not happy with how Justin Trudeau's doing or not doing, as it might be.
And this is going to be my final question, and I'll let Steve wrap it up. But this is, to both of you. There's someone listening to this that desperately wants to own a property one day, and they're trying to save for their down payment. And then they realize that they learn what a stress test is, and they talk to a mortgage broker. And again, this is not something that changing government's going to change right away, but they're getting stressed at 7%. They can't even afford. Then they're stuck in rentals. And then they just feel like they're trapped. For the younger generation, the millennials and below, I guess millennials aren't even young anymore. Can they look at a potential change in government and go, you know what, this is going to give me an opportunity to actually hit the goals that I've tried to get to in life? Because right now it feels like, even with things like rent control, which I'm fully aware are different across the country, rent control also keeps people in safe situations for a long time and doesn't encourage them to get into home ownership, which then, as Keith, your example of the woman that had to leave after how many years renting and probably pay triple in rent. So I guess my question for Keith to start here is just, there's a lot of people I know that listen to this that are in that age range. What do they need to hear?
Once you can stop the inflationary spending in the country and bring the economy back to some sort of balance, reduce the tax burden that people are facing so that their paychecks become more powerful, things become less expensive, paychecks become more powerful, there's more money left at the end of the day. You get the homes built across the continuum of housing so that the cost of housing, just quite frankly, just so it stabilizes. Mm-hmm. And you'll see that catch up happen. And the reality is some people have missed that opportunity, and they're going to have to adjust how they get ahead. And maybe it means buying a rental property in a different market from the one in which they live and work, so that they can take advantage of the structure of owning a home and the leverage of having, a mortgage to make that work. People are going to have to live in different styles of housing. Like, Tom, you probably live in a different house than you grew up in, a different style of housing that you grew up in. I do too. Like, I grew up in a house and I live in a townhouse. It's just the reality of where we're at. We're more people in the country, but we can restore the future opportunity that Canada used to offer. And it's just going to be a little harder than it was for some previous generations. And every generation, it's harder than the last one. I think this one's finally real. I felt it was harder for my generation, and I'm 42. But looking back, I'm not sure it was. I think it was probably equally as hard. It was just a different type of hard. But I honestly believe this time for the current generation, it's harder for them than it was for me. And it was equally as hard for me as it was for my parents' generation. So there is still a chance. Keep working, commit to Canada. When we get into power, we'll make sure that your tax burden is lower, the government spending is under control, the inflation tempers down, and you'll have a more powerful paycheck with which to save and ultimately buy a home. That'll be available for you because we'll have made sure that the municipalities built it by withholding the funds from them.
And Scott, anything to add to that?
Listen, I think Keith said it beautifully, actually. And my only addition that I could say to that is to all those young people who have given up hope: don't lose hope. Change is coming. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We'll get it fixed.
Yeah,
that's where it's at, Tom. Like Canadians, right now, there is a general feeling, I think, of hopelessness. I think that's what's sweeping the country right now. And I'm thinking, sitting in my 4,000 square foot house, personal gym, and all this stuff.
How many empty rooms do you have, Steve?
If I have less homelessness, I have no empty rooms. But if I have less hope than I did at some point in time, only a few years back, what is that saying for the guys that are actually struggling? I'm not struggling. I have a good business. I got a great family. I got a good support system. But for the people that don't have that, I don't see how, and I'm not going to hide anything. My views are quite public on my YouTube channel about what I think. I just don't see how, if you're struggling worse than I am, that you can just look at the options out there right now and think to yourself, oh yeah, that guy that's promising me free money for doing nothing is going to be the solution. Mm-hmm. Right? This is oh man, this is becoming quite the ad for you guys. This is not what this was meant to be. But this is, it is quite literally, as they're saying, common sense. This is going to be, whenever it does happen, it's going to be an election that is based on the majority of people making their decision on probably carbon tax. It's probably where the decision is being made. And I just think that this doesn't go for these guys being politicians, future politicians. This doesn't go for our current government. I just think, like, as a Canadian, you can't let your hope be destroyed by a few idiots in power, right? You have to keep that hope. And right now, that hope, that the little bit of hope that people do have, is likely going to be in a change of a federal government. And I think I wish you guys well. And hopefully, maybe that's even called an election before this even comes out. We could only be so lucky. But I still think I'm going to hang my hat on somewhere around end of February. We're gonna Jagmeet's confidence is really going to leave, and then he'll
or he's going to get his home equity tax and he'll stay around.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that guy is, I'm sorry, I don't know if you guys are allowed to say this or not, but I think that guy is such a snake that I don't think Canadians are going to be fooled by him whatsoever. I think there's a few areas where they're used to government handouts, so they want to hear more of that, but I don't think the majority of Canadians think that guy is credible at all.
Okay, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Keith. Keith and Scott, is there anywhere that the viewers can go if they want to learn more about each of you online? And we can put this in the description as well.
Yeah, keithroy.ca is the campaign website. We accept donations there as well for the campaign. But keithroy.com is my real estate website. If you find yourself moving to the Lower Mainland and want to transact, I still need to sell homes and make a living. Being a candidate is not a job; it's a passion. So happy to help those people, but more importantly, I want to talk to voters in West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Awesome. And Scott?
Yeah, I'm on all the social media channels as well. Scott Aitchison, MP. I have a website, scottaitchisonmp.ca, and yeah, follow me. I've got a YouTube channel too. It's all just my name. So
I checked out your YouTube channel. I gotta say, I love the videos when you guys are grilling each other across the table, going back and forth. There's just something about it. It's great. It's great. The best reality TV that's out there. Absolutely love it. Thank you both for being here, and thank you for having this conversation on this platform. Me and Steve have learned that a lot of people in your positions aren't willing to actually come and have real conversations. And I know you are both classified as politicians, but you gave us real answers, and we appreciate that. And I hope the audience appreciated it as well. Thank you, everybody, for watching, listening. I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next week. Bye.